On my wedding day, I suffered a mysterious accident and fell into a coma. Unplug her, I can finally run away with all her money, my husband told a nurse. But he forgot one small detail and paid for all his wickedness in the worst possible way. Candido was a poker player. From a young age, he had learned that his skill with cards and his charisma could take him far, though not in the most honest way. His strategy wasn't just to play well, but also to find wealthy women to support him. With a charming smile and an air of mystery, he had accomplished what many would consider impossible, winning hearts while also seizing others' fortunes. The first time he did it, it was almost by accident. He met Marta, a wealthy and lonely woman, at one of those private games in an exclusive club. Marta was captivated by his skill at the poker table and, above all, by the confidence he exuded. Before long, they were dating. Candido showered her with attention and promised her a life full of excitement. Marta was willing to spend whatever it took to keep him close, and that was exactly what Candido exploited. Within months, Marta was drowning in debt and her fortune had vanished. When she needed him most, he simply left, abandoning her to ruin. After that episode, Candido decided it was best to seek new opportunities elsewhere. He left the country, the debts, and the problems behind, settling in a new city, ready to start over. That's where he met Irene. Irene was everything Candido needed: intelligent, beautiful, and, most importantly, from a wealthy family. Her parents had thriving businesses, and although Irene didn't flaunt her wealth, Candido knew how to spot the signs of a comfortable and privileged life. She was the perfect next target. The first meeting was casual, or at least that's what Candido made it seem. He observed her for days before deciding to approach. He saw her at the cafe she frequented, always with a book in hand, and studied her gestures, her smiles, the way she spoke to the waiter. He knew he had to be careful, that he couldn't rush things. When he finally introduced himself, he did it as though it were a coincidence, as if fate had placed them in the same place at the same time. "Excuse me, is that a Murakami book?" Candido asked with an intriguing smile, pointing to the cover Irene was holding. Irene looked up and met the gaze of a confident-looking man with a warm smile that disarmed any defenses. She nodded slowly, surprised by the sudden interest. "Yes, it is. Do you know his work?" She responded, unaware that this question would be the beginning of something that would change her life forever. Candido sat next to her, and the conversation flowed so naturally that Irene felt comfortable immediately. They talked about books, music, and travel. Everything about him seemed genuine, from his laughter to the way he listened to every word she said. But behind that facade was something darker, something Irene couldn't even imagine. Candido knew exactly what to say, how to look at her, how to make her feel special. Over time, their relationship blossomed. Candido was always attentive, always present, showering her with thoughtful gestures and promises of a future together. Irene, who had never experienced such an intense relationship, fell deeply in love. Slowly but surely, Candido ingrained himself into her life, meeting her friends, earning her parents' favor. Everything was going according to plan. When he finally proposed, he did so in a spectacular way at an elegant restaurant under the stars. Irene accepted with tears in her eyes, convinced she was about to begin the happiest chapter of her life. But for Candido, it was just the next step toward what he truly wanted, her family's fortune. In the days leading up to the wedding, Irene began to notice certain signs, small things that didn't quite add up. Candido avoided certain topics, particularly those about his past. He always found the perfect excuse to avoid talking about his family or past relationships. Irene tried not to dwell on it, thinking it was just pre-wedding nerves, but deep down, a voice was telling her something wasn't right. That voice became impossible to ignore the day she received the anonymous call. "Don't marry that man, please. He's not who he says he is," said a woman's voice on the other end of the line. Irene felt a chill as she heard those words. The voice was familiar, and the tone carried genuine desperation. "Who are you? What do you mean by that?" Irene asked, trying to remain calm. "I'm Marta's mother. My daughter was Candido's first victim. I can't let the same thing happen to you, the voice replied, laden with pain and urgency. He isn't the man he claims to be. Please, listen to me. Marta was destroyed after what he did to her. Candido left her in ruins, manipulated her, and when she had nothing left, he walked away without looking back. Irene was paralyzed, unable to process the magnitude of what she had just heard. She remembered how Candido avoided talking about his past and how he always changed the subject when his life before her was brought up. She felt her heart sink, a mixture of sadness and fear washing over her. But how do you know it's me? How did you know I was about to marry him? Irene asked, barely managing to keep her voice steady. I've been looking for you because I knew Candido would do it again. I saw the photos, the announcements about your engagement. I know this is sudden, but if you've ever loved anyone, if you've ever cared about someone other than yourself, you'll understand why I couldn't stay silent. My daughter suffered, Irene. She suffered in ways no one should ever suffer. Don't let the same thing happen to you. Candido isn't the businessman he pretends to be. He's a poker player with vices and lies. The line was silent for a moment. Irene felt as though the ground had vanished beneath her feet. She remembered every gesture, every look, every word from Candido. Everything seemed to make sense now, but in the most painful way possible. She couldn't stand idly by. She couldn't ignore what she had just heard. The next day, Irene decided to contact Marta's mother. She needed to know the truth firsthand. They arranged to meet at a small cafe away from the bustle of the city. When Irene arrived, she saw a woman with a tired but resolute demeanor. Her eyes were filled with deep sadness, but also determination. Thank you for coming, the woman said as Irene sat down across from her. I couldn't ignore what you told me, Irene replied. I need to know everything that happened to your daughter. Marta's mother nodded slowly and began to tell the story. She spoke of how her daughter had met Candido, how he had wormed his way into her life, promising her the world. The way he had made her go into debt, manipulated her into spending everything she had. Marta had been a strong and brilliant woman, but Candido had pushed her to the limit, and when she had nothing left to give, he simply disappeared, leaving her broken and with nothing. I don't want the same thing to happen to you, Irene. I know he seems like a charming man, but behind that facade, there's only self-interest. He doesn't love anyone but himself, and when you're no longer useful to him, he'll do the same to you, the woman warned with a trembling voice. Irene sat in silence, feeling the weight of the words crushing her. Everything she believed about Candido was beginning to crumble. She felt a knot in her stomach and a deep pain in her chest. She knew she had to confront Candido, but she also knew she needed to be prepared for whatever came next. For the first time, she understood that her life, her future, was in danger. And she wouldn't let anyone destroy her the way Marta had been destroyed. Irene had spent the night awake, reflecting on everything she had discovered. The words of Marta's mother kept echoing in her mind, like a sound impossible to silence. Candido was not the man she thought he was, and the pain of that reality was slowly consuming her. She felt betrayed, deceived, but also determined to uncover the whole truth, no matter how painful it was. That morning, she got up with a clarity she hadn't felt before. She would not get married until all her doubts were fully resolved. Early in the morning, she called Candido and asked him to meet her at her apartment. She couldn't wait any longer. She couldn't live with that uncertainty anymore. Candido agreed in a casual tone, not suspecting that Irene was about to confront him with a truth he thought buried. When he arrived, he wore the same confident smile as always, but Irene could no longer see in him the man she had fallen in love with. She saw a stranger, an imposter. What's wrong, love? Candido asked as he walked in, noticing the seriousness on Irene's face. Irene took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. She didn't want him to see the pain in her eyes. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction of knowing how much he had hurt her. We need to talk, Candido. There's something I need to know. Something I can't let go, she said, pointing to the couch for him to sit. Candido dropped into the couch with a relaxed attitude, but there was a slight tension in his gaze. Irene noticed it, and it pushed her to be more direct. "I got a call yesterday," Irene began, locking her eyes on him. "It was Marta's mother. She told me about your relationship with her daughter, about what you did to her. I want to know the truth. I want to hear your version without lies." Candido blinked, clearly surprised. His expression shifted from nonchalance to disbelief, and then to something Irene hadn't seen before: fear. He tried to compose himself, sitting up straighter on the couch and forcing a nervous smile. "Irene, that's a misunderstanding. Yes, Marta and I had a relationship, but things didn't happen the way her mother told you. She always blamed me for Marta's financial troubles, but the truth is, Marta had a lot of issues before she met me," Candido said, trying to sound convincing. But Irene wasn't going to let herself be manipulated. She had heard enough. She had seen the pain in Marta's mother's eyes, the sadness in her voice. She knew there was more to the story, something Candido was still hiding. "Don't lie to me, Candido," Irene said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm not asking for an excuse. I'm asking for the truth. If you can't be honest with me now, then this ends here." Candido was silent for a long moment, his face losing all expression. The mask of confidence he always wore seemed to crumble before Irene's eyes. Finally, he sighed and lowered his gaze. "Fine. I'll tell you the truth," he said quietly, almost as if it hurt to admit. "Yes, I was with Marta for her money. It didn't start that way. At first, I thought I really loved her, but things changed. I lost my job, and she had a life I couldn't maintain on my own. I became dependent, and when things got complicated, I didn't know how to get out, so I left. I left her. And yes, I left her in ruins. But I didn't plan it from the start. I'm not a monster, Irene." Irene felt her heart shatter as she listened to his confession. Every word was like a dagger. She couldn't believe the man she had planned to spend her life with was saying this to her, and worse, that he seemed to justify it as a mere mistake. "And what about me?" she asked, tears beginning to well up in her eyes. "What am I to you, Candido? Just another target? Just another woman you can take advantage of?" Candido shook his head quickly, his eyes pleading. "No, Irene, you're not that. I love you, truly. With you, it's different. I want a life with you. I want to leave all that behind, I promise. I can change. I'll do whatever it takes to prove to you that I'm sincere," he said, moving closer to her, trying to take her hand. But Irene pulled away, standing up from the couch. Tears were already streaming down her cheeks, and she couldn't bear for him to touch her. Everything felt like a lie. Every gesture, every promise. She needed time. She needed space to think. "I can't do this, Candido. I can't marry you while there are still lies between us. I need time to process all of this, and you need to prove that you truly want to change. I don't know if I can forgive you, but I know that right now, I can't move forward with this wedding," Irene said, her voice firm despite the pain. Candido nodded slowly, his eyes filled with despair. "Please, don't leave me, Irene. Give me a chance to fix this. I'll do whatever it takes." "I promise," he insisted, but deep down, he knew there was nothing more he could say. Irene looked at him one last time, trying to find the man she had fallen in love with, but all she saw was a stranger, someone who had hidden his true nature behind a carefully crafted facade. She turned around and walked out of the apartment without looking back, leaving Candido alone in the room. As she stepped out onto the street, Irene took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill her lungs. She felt broken, but also free. She had made the hardest decision of her life, but she knew it was the right one. She couldn't go on living a lie, couldn't build her future on such a fragile and deceitful foundation. She didn't yet know what she would do, or if she could ever forgive Candido, but she was certain of one thing: her life was her own, and she wouldn't let anyone else destroy it. With tears in her eyes and a heavy heart, Irene headed toward her car. She needed the comfort of her family, the support of her parents that only they could provide. She got into the car, started the engine, and began driving toward her parents' house. Each mile she traveled seemed to clear her mind a little more, as if simply distancing herself from the lie was helping her regain a part of herself. The road was quiet, with barely any traffic at that hour of the afternoon. Irene stared ahead, but in her mind, images of her conversation with Candido replayed over and over. She remembered his pleading eyes, his attempts to justify the unjustifiable. A mix of sadness and anger took hold of her, and with each breath, she tried to calm herself and focus on the road. But then, in an instant, everything changed. A flash of light to her right, the blare of a horn, and before she could react, a vehicle appeared out of nowhere, crossing unexpectedly into her path. Irene turned the wheel desperately, trying to avoid the collision, but it was too late. The impact was brutal, the sound of metal against metal filled the air, and Irene's car was sent hurtling off to the side of the road. Everything happened in a matter of seconds, but for Irene, it felt like time had stopped. She felt her body slam against the seat, the lights flickering, the world spinning out of control. Then, absolute silence. Darkness enveloped her as her consciousness faded, leaving everything in a cold and distant void. The accident did not go unnoticed. Passing drivers immediately stopped and called emergency services. Chaos erupted on the road as several people ran toward Irene's car, trying to see if the driver was okay. Inside the vehicle, Irene lay unconscious, her face with minor cuts, her breathing barely perceptible. The mobile phone she had left on the passenger seat rang incessantly. It was her mother, worried because Irene hadn't yet arrived home. When emergency services arrived, they quickly extricated Irene from the car. Paramedics worked with precision and urgency, stabilizing her before rushing her to the nearest hospital. One of them, while securing her on the stretcher, couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness at seeing the elegant dress she still wore, as if Irene's life had been interrupted in the middle of an important moment. Hours later, at the hospital, doctors informed Irene's parents about her condition. They had arrived in a panic, filled with fear and desperation after receiving news of the accident. The doctor, with a grave but calm expression, explained that Irene had suffered a traumatic brain injury and was in a coma. They could give no guarantees, couldn't say when or if she would wake up. Everything depended on how her body responded in the coming hours and days. Irene's mother collapsed into her husband's arms, her sobs echoing through the hospital corridor. All she wanted was for her daughter to be okay, to open her eyes and tell her everything would be fine. Irene's father, his eyes filled with restrained tears, took his wife's hand and led her to the room where their daughter lay. The sight of Irene connected to machines, her eyes closed and her expression serene, was too much for them to bear. They sat by her side, each taking one of her hands, whispering words of encouragement, praying that Irene could hear them, that she would know she wasn't alone. Meanwhile, in his apartment, Candido stared at his phone again and again, waiting for a call, a message, anything from Irene. The uncertainty was driving him mad. He knew he had ruined everything, but he still hoped he could fix it. He didn't know that at that very moment, the woman he claimed to love was fighting for her life, trapped in a dream from which no one knew if she would awaken. Irene lay in the hospital bed, her body motionless, her face serene, but inside, her mind was still active, trapped in a sort of limbo. Everything was dark, and although she couldn't move a single muscle, she could hear the voices around her, feel the presence of those nearby. The gentle voice of her mother, the words of encouragement from her father. They were there every day, without fail, holding her hand and praying for her recovery. It was their comfort, the spark that kept her clinging to the thin thread connecting her consciousness to the outside world. Yet, she also heard other voices, voices that brought no comfort but instead a deep and growing fear. Candido arrived one afternoon, as if it were just another visit, but Irene sensed something different in his tone, something unlike the sweetness of her parents' voices. He approached her bed and, with a heavy sigh, took Irene's hand. The voice that came from his mouth was not that of a man worried about his fiancée, but someone frustrated by his own misfortune. "Irene, you can't do this to me," he said, gripping her hand firmly. "You can't die, do you hear me? I spent a lot of money on that ring, and this isn't what we planned. I made an effort. You can't just leave me here, not after all the work I've put in. Candido's words echoed in the darkness of Irene's mind. They were cold, devoid of any love. Each syllable was an invisible slap, a new confirmation that this man didn't see her, didn't value her, but only the reflection of his own interests. Irene felt a pang of anguish, a mix of sadness and frustration that trapped her in that prison of darkness and silence. Then there was silence, a long, uncomfortable silence, broken only by the constant beeping of the machines monitoring her vital signs. Irene, trapped in her immobile body, could feel the tension in the room. Candido let go of her hand and began pacing back and forth as if searching for a solution. That's when the door opened and someone entered the room. It was a nurse. Irene recognized her by the softness of her steps and the meticulous routine with which she checked the machines and cables keeping her alive. But something was different this time. Candido looked at her with a strange smile, a manipulative glint in his eyes that made Irene, even though she couldn't see it, feel a shiver run through her mind. "Nurse," Candido said in an almost friendly tone, as if trying to start a casual conversation. "I know you're all doing your best here, and I really appreciate the effort you're making to help her get better, but..." He paused, as if searching for the right words. "I'm willing to offer a reward, something that might motivate her recovery to move a little faster. I understand that sometimes the process can be lengthy, but if we could find a way to speed things up, I'd be happy to compensate generously." The nurse seemed to fall silent. Irene couldn't see the woman's reaction, but she could imagine the conflict in her gaze. The silence grew heavy, and then Candido, as if to reinforce his point, added in a lower tone, "I'm serious. I can pay well. Don't worry about the details. Just do whatever it takes to help her wake up. I want her back, and I'm willing to pay whatever it takes. I think we can come to an understanding, don't you?" Irene felt a mixture of horror and desperation. She knew what Candido meant, knew that he wasn't offering money out of genuine concern for her, but because his plan, his lies, everything he had built, was crumbling with each day she remained in a coma. Hearing those words from his mouth was like poison spreading through her being, making her feel even more trapped, more powerless than ever. The nurse hesitated, her steps bringing her closer to Irene's bed as she checked the monitors and the patient's condition. Finally, her voice broke the silence, cautious but audible. I don't know if there's anything I can do, sir. The doctors have protocols we must follow." But she paused, as if weighing her options. "I'll do what I can to help. I'll make some inquiries. That's all I'm asking," Candido replied, his tone shifting back to affable, almost charming. "And trust me, your efforts will be well rewarded. Just make sure she wakes up. The rest, we'll deal with that later." Irene felt each word like chains binding her more deeply to that bed. She was trapped, listening to how the person who claimed to love her was willing to manipulate even her recovery for his own benefit. The tears she couldn't shed burned within her, and her heart pounded with a mixture of rage and sadness. She didn't know how she would do it, but somehow, she had to find a way to fight this darkness. She had to wake up, she had to come back. Not for Candido, not to fulfill any plan, but to free herself from him, to reclaim her life once and for all. The days passed, and although Candido returned with his empty words and false promises, Irene also heard the voices of her parents. They spoke to her of the future, of the plans they would make when she woke up, of the vacations they would take together. Her mother recounted stories from her childhood, trying to fill her with happy memories, with real love. Her father read aloud from books she had always loved, as if with each word he hoped to restore a fragment of her spirit. It was in those moments that Irene felt something different. As if a small light began to break through the darkness, a light calling to her, pushing her to keep fighting. She knew she couldn't give up. She had heard enough, had understood the truth about Candido, and couldn't let him control her fate. She wouldn't give up, not while she knew there were people who truly loved her, who were willing to wait as long as it took for her to wake up. Amid the darkness of her mind, Irene began to focus on that light, on her mother's gentle voice, on her father's words. She needed to hold on to everything real, everything worth fighting for, and with each mental effort, she tried to draw closer to that voice, to that love. Because no matter how hard it was, she was determined. She would not let Candido dictate her destiny. The battle for her life was just beginning. Candido's plan was beginning to take a darker shape. Intent on achieving what he so desperately desired, he decided not to walk alone on the path of lies. The nurse, who initially seemed like a secondary character, became a key piece in the strategy. She was a shrewd woman, accustomed to acting with coldness and without scruples, exactly what Candido needed. One ordinary afternoon, Candido invited her for a coffee in the back of the clinic. The two sat down, away from the prying eyes of staff and patients. Candido leaned toward her, his smile a blend of complicity and cynicism. "Look, I have a proposal for you, but you need to understand what's at stake," he said, staring intensely into the nurse's dark eyes. "When this is all over and I marry Irene, I'll take everything she has. All her money will be ours, and you'll be my woman. There's no reason she should keep what she doesn't deserve, that fortune she doesn't even know how to enjoy." The nurse raised an eyebrow, tilting her head. The idea sounded crazy, even dangerous, but also exciting. She was tired of her mundane life, her routine of endless shifts at the clinic, dealing with nameless, storyless patients. And power, or at least the promise of it, held an irresistible allure. "And what is it about Irene that makes her so special?" the nurse asked disdainfully, letting out an ironic smile. "She seems so weak, so uninteresting." "I'll tell you something, Candido, I honestly don't understand what you see in her." Candido leaned back and let out a bitter laugh. "Irene's in a coma. I don't see anything in her except a fat bank account and an easy situation to exploit," he said mockingly. "Really, she's like a bargain bin version of Ugly Betty. So skinny and graceless. She has nothing compared to you, my love. Beauty, intelligence, and a spark that makes me want more." The nurse blushed slightly. There was something about Candido's blunt honesty that, while cruel, filled her with a strange sense of power. It felt as if they were two predators hunting the easiest prey, caught in a game they knew could end disastrously, but one they didn't want to escape. "And what do you need me to do?" she finally asked after a long silence, broken only by the distant echoes of the clinic's hallways. Candido smiled, taking the nurse's hand and squeezing it gently. "For now, I need you to continue being my link here. Make sure Irene stays in the coma with no changes. She trusts you, and that's key for what's coming next. Once I've got the ring on her finger, it'll be easy to take everything from her." The nurse nodded. There was a strange complicity between them, a sort of electricity ignited by the promise of revenge and power. The nurse, aware of the darkness this entailed, felt more alive than ever. "Then it's a deal," she said, gripping Candido's hand firmly. "But I want my share when this is over. I'm not taking the risk without my reward." Candido nodded, leaning closer to whisper in her ear. "We'll have everything we want. Irene is nothing more than a bridge to a better life, my love. And I promise, once we're on the other side, she'll no longer exist in our story." Both laughed, a dark, complicit laugh that filled the space between them. Candido knew the nurse would be the key to keeping Irene where he wanted her, in a coma, vulnerable, trapped in a web of sweet words and endless lies. Meanwhile, Irene remained unaware that the man she had opened her heart to was conspiring against her with an ally in the shadows. Her world was shrouded in a dense fog, and she couldn't even imagine the storm that was brewing. The nurse and Candido parted with a knowing look. From that moment, the alliance was sealed. The innocent Irene, who believed she had found someone to share her life with, was drifting further from the truth as the sinister plan advanced amidst malicious laughter and hollow promises. Irene was not as far from the truth as Candido and the nurse thought. A few days earlier, her body had begun to show signs of recovery. Small movements in her fingers, involuntary blinks, and a slight change in her breathing had led the medical staff to suspect that something was changing. Dr. Ramirez, a committed man with a particular affection for Irene, noticed these improvements. He remained vigilant, attentive to any progress. One afternoon, while Candido and the nurse were talking in Irene's room, they did not realize that something had changed. Although the monitors showed no significant changes, Irene, in a deep corner of her consciousness, had begun to listen. The voices arrived muffled at first, like a distant echo, but then each word became clearer and more piercing. "I see nothing in her but a full bank account," Candido said with a sarcastic laugh. His voice filled the room like a dark cloud, but now it also filtered into Irene's mind. "She is just a means to an end." The words resonated, striking Irene's heart. While her eyes remained closed and her body motionless, her mind began to awaken. The betrayal she was experiencing, coming from the person she had trusted, filled her with a mix of pain and determination. Now, in that state of semi-consciousness, she vowed to herself not to be the defenseless victim that Candido thought she was. The nurse leaned towards Candido and whispered something that made him burst out laughing again. Irene, powerless in her bed, felt a growing anger build up in her chest. She couldn't move, she couldn't speak, but something inside her was fighting with all its might to return. The conversation continued for a few more minutes until, finally, both left the room, leaving Irene with her lonely determination. That same night, Dr. Ramirez came in to perform his routine checks. He approached Irene's bed and leaned over her, looking for signs of progress. Suddenly, he noticed something different. Irene's fingers moved, barely perceptible, but enough for him to understand that something was changing. "Irene, if you can hear me, move your fingers again," the doctor said, his voice low and full of hope. To his surprise, Irene's fingers moved again. The doctor felt a chill run down his spine, and a sincere smile crossed his face. He knew he was facing a crucial moment. Slowly, Dr. Ramirez began to speak to her, encouraging her to cling to life, to keep fighting. The next day, Candido and the nurse returned to the room. The confidence in their gestures showed they suspected nothing of Irene's progress. As they discussed plans for the money and how easy it would be to handle everything once Irene was no longer a problem, Dr. Ramirez entered the room. "Oh, doctor," Candido exclaimed with a forced smile. "We were just talking about how grateful we are for all the care you've given Irene." The doctor nodded without showing much emotion. He knew much more than Candido thought, and all he wanted was to ensure that Irene had a fair chance. He approached the bed and leaned over her. "Good morning, Irene," he said aloud. "Today seems to be a good day, doesn't it?" To everyone's surprise, Irene slowly opened her eyes. Candido's eyes widened, and the nurse nearly dropped the tray she was holding. Dr. Ramirez smiled with a mix of satisfaction and relief. "Irene, if you can hear me, blink twice," the doctor said. Irene, her heart pounding and her throat dry, blinked twice. The moment was filled with tension and surprise. Candido tried to disguise his disarray, but fear began to seep into his gestures. This is incredible," Candido said, trying to sound excited. "My love, you're waking up." Irene looked at him, and although she couldn't speak, her eyes conveyed something different, something that Candido couldn't decipher. The connection between Dr. Ramirez and Irene was immediate. Both knew there was a hidden truth that needed to come to light. At that moment, Irene knew the doctor was her ally. In the following days, Dr. Ramirez and Irene began to quietly devise a plan. As she slowly regained her mobility, the doctor explained how they could expose Candido and the nurse. Ramirez documented every conversation between the two conspirators, hiding a microphone in the room. Irene, for her part, made a superhuman effort to stay alert, resisting the urge to shout the truth at every moment. Candido and the nurse, oblivious to Irene's new reality, continued their usual visits, confident that their prey was still trapped in the limbo of the coma. Every word, every malicious laugh, every detail of the plan was recorded and taken to Dr. Ramirez, who awaited the precise moment to strike the final blow. Irene, though weak, was no longer the vulnerable woman they thought. Her pain had transformed into an unstoppable force, a fierce will to reclaim her life and, above all, to unmask the betrayal. She knew that moment was approaching, and with the doctor by her side, she prepared to confront those who, in their greed, had underestimated her. Dr. Ramirez was ready. The evidence he had gathered against Candido and the nurse was overwhelming, and he knew he could not allow Irene to continue being manipulated and mistreated. Irene, for her part, had regained much of her mobility, though each movement cost her a monumental effort. However, nothing could bend the strength of her will. Candido's betrayal had left her shattered, but at the same time, more determined than ever. One morning, as the sun filtered through the blinds of the room, Dr. Ramirez leaned over to Irene and whispered, "Today is the day, Irene. We have gathered enough evidence and the police are ready to intervene. All we need is the last piece, and I'm sure we will get it today." Irene looked into his eyes, and with a look full of gratitude and determination, she nodded slightly. She knew this was the moment when she had to face reality, not just to save herself, but to end the cruel game of Candido and the nurse. Dr. Ramirez stood up and checked the hidden equipment, ensuring everything was in place. Every word, every whisper would be recorded. It wasn't long before the door to the room slowly opened. Candido entered with an expression that was meant to be affectionate but could no longer deceive Irene. Behind him, the nurse closed the door, dropping the mask of professionalism and showing her true face, a cold and calculating smile. "My love, how are you feeling today?" Candido asked in a honeyed voice as he approached the bed. Irene stared at him, unblinking, and with great effort, tried to move her lips. She whispered a word that was barely audible. "Strength." "What did you say, dear?" Candido asked, leaning in with a tense smile, but Irene remained silent, leaving him puzzled. The nurse approached the other side of the bed and placed her hand on Irene's arm, giving it gentle taps. "You need to recover soon, Irene. You know we are all worried about you," she said hypocritically, casting a furtive glance at Candido. Candido chuckled softly, as if it were all an internal joke that Irene would never be part of. He moved to the window and looked outside, speaking without much attention. "Just think how quickly we can sort things out once you're fully recovered." "Well, if you do recover, that is," he said with a twisted smile that the nurse shared. At that moment, Dr. Ramirez, who had been waiting outside, opened the door decisively. His sudden appearance surprised Candido and the nurse, who tried to compose themselves. "Doctor, we didn't know you were coming so soon," Candido said, forcing a smile. Dr. Ramirez looked at them sternly, without a trace of sympathy. "I need to speak with both of you." "Outside the room," he said, his voice carrying authority. The nurse tensed for a second and then nodded, exchanging a look with Candido before leaving. Candido lingered for a moment, looking at Irene, as if trying to decipher something in her expression, but eventually he also left, closing the door behind him. Dr. Ramirez turned to Irene, who looked at him with a mix of fear and hope. "I'm going to end this, Irene." "Today," he assured her. He squeezed her hand briefly before leaving the room to confront the two conspirators. In the hallway, the nurse and Candido waited with tense expressions. Dr. Ramirez looked at them, took a deep breath, and began. "I have been closely following Irene's situation and her progress. And I've also noticed certain irregularities in her treatment, things that simply do not add up," the doctor said, fixing his eyes on the nurse, whose expression began to show signs of worry. Candido tried to interrupt, but the doctor raised a hand to stop him. "Please, Candido, I've heard enough lies. We have evidence, and at this moment, the police are already aware of what has been happening here," he said firmly. Candido's face lost color, and the nurse began to step back, her face filled with panic. At that moment, two police officers appeared at the end of the hallway, walking towards them with determination. Candido Jimenez, Elena Marquez, one of the officers said firmly, "You are under arrest for conspiracy and abuse against patient Irene Martinez." The look of surprise and terror on their faces was evident. Candido tried to speak, but the words choked in his throat. The nurse, with trembling hands, offered no resistance as the officers handcuffed them. From the door of her room, Irene listened to the sounds in the hallway. She felt a tear roll down her cheek, but it was not a tear of sadness. It was a mixture of relief, justice, and the promise of a new beginning. She knew the road ahead would be long, but she was no longer alone, and most importantly, she was no longer a victim. Dr. Ramirez re-entered the room once the officers had taken Candido and the nurse away. He looked at Irene, and with a warm and sincere smile, he said, "We did it, Irene. Now it's your turn to live again, without fear, without shadows." Irene closed her eyes and took a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, she felt the air fill her lungs freely. The sun continued to come in through the window, and with it, the hope of a better future began to blossom. In the days that followed, as Irene continued her recovery, a sense of justice began to take shape within her. There was something she needed to do before she could leave it all behind. She asked Dr. Ramirez to arrange a meeting with other women who had been victims of Candido, women who had been deceived and stripped of their possessions by the man who was now paying his debt to justice. Gathered in a discreet room, each woman shared her story, and although there was pain in their words, there was also a strength that united them. Irene stood up with the help of the doctor and, looking at each of them, spoke with a firm voice. What Marta's mother told me was true. Candido was a fortune hunter, a vicious man who lived off deception, manipulation. We have all been victims of his cruelty and greed, but he did not get away with it with us. Today, we are here to close this chapter, to ensure he pays for every tear he caused us to shed. The women nodded, some with tears in their eyes, others with determined expressions. They decided to join forces and file additional charges against Candido. It was time to heal the wounds, to turn the pain into strength and justice. The process was long, but in the end, Candido was convicted not only for the abuse against Irene, but also for fraud and deception against all those women. On the day Candido was taken to prison, Irene was there, alongside Marta and the other women. There was no hatred in their eyes, only determination and the desire for justice to prevail. Candido looked at them with a mix of anger and despair, but he no longer had any power over them. Irene felt the weight of betrayal finally dissipate, making room for forgiveness and growth. "You didn't succeed in your evil with me, Candido. And now you have to pay," Irene said, with a calm but firm voice as he was led away. After the verdict, Irene allowed herself to start anew. She moved to a small house near the countryside, where she could watch the sunrise every morning and feel the peace she had longed for. Marta visited her often, and together they laughed, reminisced, and made plans for the future. The women who had once been victims were now friends, united by an experience that had taught them the true value of life. Dr. Ramirez remained a part of her life, always ready to support her and provide the care she needed. Over time, Irene discovered that, even after so much pain, love could be reborn. Not a love dependent on appearances or empty promises, but a true love built on trust and mutual respect. The sun continued to enter through the window of her new home, and each ray reminded her that there was always an opportunity to be reborn, to start anew without fear, without shadows. Irene had reclaimed her life, and although the scars would always be there, so would the strength she had found amid the darkness. And so, with the support of her friends and Dr. Ramirez, she began a new chapter filled with hope, surrounded by people who loved her and without any more shadows to disturb her. The grand finale was not an ending, but a beginning. A beginning where justice, love, and friendship were the pillars of a new, free life. Irene knew her story would be an example for many people, a story of survival, strength, and the promise that even in the darkest moments, light always finds its way. If you enjoyed this story, I invite you to leave in the comments what you felt while listening. And if you have been through a similar situation of deception, I would love to hear your valuable opinion. I would be very honored if you leave a like, share the video with a friend or family member, and subscribe to the channel. Do not miss the next amazing story that is appearing on your screen right now. We have guaranteed entertainment exclusively for you. See you in the next video.